On March 2nd, 2003, at 4:12 p.m, I disappeared. My name is Isabella V. I'm 20-something, and I'm an international fugitive. My name is Isabella V, but it isn't. These were the words of a mysterious European heiress in one of her first posts on a blog she created to tell the story of her enthralling past and document her uncertain future, both of which are so bizarre that one might think they were fabricated. But there's way more to this than your average fictional internet tale or ARG. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video is sponsored by Huge Casino. Huge Casino is a thrilling mobile game that's free to download on iOS and Android, comprised of over 100 online casino games from retro classics to modern slot machines, as well as poker, roulette, baccarat, and blackjack. You can compete against other players, join clubs to play with your friends, and compete in the Billionaire League. I always thought casino games looked really fun, but honestly I'm too scared to actually gamble, and that's why I love this game. It's just for entertainment only and doesn't offer real money gambling, so you can enjoy the excitement of a casino without any of the risks. My favourite slot is the Ancient Forest. It's designed beautifully and looks very cute, but there are various others, all with different visuals, so there's a setting to suit everyone. Click the link in the description to download Huge Casino for free and get 5 million chips. I'd love to hear what your favourite slots are, so please come back and leave a comment when you've tried some of them. Isabella V created her blog known as She's a Flight Risk in March 2003, just a couple of weeks after she decided to disappear, leaving her family and her home country to go on the run and start a new life under a new identity. A life much less safe and secure than the one she had known before. She decided to start blogging her life for similar reasons most bloggers do, but also some other pretty unique reasons, particularly that she hoped creating an online presence would give her some level of protection in case she was ever caught, which didn't seem like a hugely unlikely possibility. But what was Isabella running from? Here's some context in her own words. I've been thinking a lot lately about what makes people resort to drastic measures. Of course, my own departure and vanishing act could very well have been a drastic overreaction. I looked back for most of last week, trying to find the trigger. At one point, far after the point of no return for me, I could scarcely believe that I wasn't in a dream. How had I been pushed so far? It was no one thing that triggered my decision though, as I think about it. My family, my father. My family is an alarmingly influential pillar of a small European country, deeply meshed into the financial fabric of the nation and at the core characterised by the highest extremes of power and influence. I grew up the youngest of 4 and the only girl in a disturbingly Byzantine environment. When I was about 13, I found I had a curiously hard time watching any of the Godfather movies, primarily as a result of what I can only call a disarming similarity between Michael Corleone and my father. Is my father a mobster? No, not in the conventional sense. Has my father had men killed, women killed? Maybe. I don't rightly know, and certainly, even if I did, I would never admit it here. But if he hasn't, it's not for a lack of logistic or ethical capacity. I wouldn't necessarily call my father evil, but there is no doubt that a certain moral agility expands his worldview, and this, coupled with a compelling sense of overarching duty. Our family traces its roots back 17 generations, to the time of the Renaissance. 17 generations of fiscal conservatism. 17 generations of dynastic preservation and successful machinations, 17 generations of wealth accumulation, 17 generations of primogeniture, 17 generations of sinister momentum. That kind of history, the kind that transcends dozens of legal systems, eras, and geopolitical phases, tends to give one a sense of immunity. Immunity from the trite and flightly whims of society. Immunity from authorities with 4-year terms, or indeed any body at all that cannot trace its own roots back to the 1600s as well. In short, my father is a very wealthy, connected, and powerful man. Even as I look at those words on the screen, they seem to pale entirely in comparison to the reality that is my father. And while these properties may have coexisted peacefully for some time without crossing my path, it was this drive, built up almost as ocean waves might be driven over hundreds of kilometers before a storm, that finally put us at odds. It was also that quiet, calculating, and powerfully penetrating calm that terrifies me sometimes. The collected expression of a chess player who has total command of the field and his opponent. You can see it in him. The cool, elegant composure of the deadliest and most unpredictable of foes. I see it in my chase nightmares now, looking coolly across the table in a cafe as if he had been there watching me every day for weeks and I'd just now noticed. Christopher Walken, Kasparov, Sir Francis Walsingham. Despite this, and drastically, my father made 4 mistakes. He gave birth to a redhead and a daddy's little girl. He sent me to the United States before I was 9. He made me in his own image and taught me entirely too well. And then he arranged my marriage to Eve. Isabella's original blog was deleted. From what I gather, she wrote her last entry in 2006, then took it down later that year, or in 2007, after something happened that I assume caused her to worry that she might be located by her family. Aside from the occasional comment from her elsewhere online on articles and blog posts that mentioned her, no one heard from her for years, leaving her followers wondering where in the world she was and if her family had finally caught up to her. Then in 2013, she returned with a new blog. Of course, she was still as cryptic as always about her identity, her current location, and exactly what was going on in her life. She shared some of her old posts, and it's quite interesting reading them now with annotations providing her thoughts, feelings, and some extra context on things she had written so many years ago. However, most of her old posts are no longer available. The URL of her original blog has been excluded from the Wayback Machine. Another blogger had saved many of them and reposted them around 2009, but Isabella asked them to remove the archive, and I haven't been able to find any other archives elsewhere, leaving many of the events of 2003 to 2006 a mystery until further notice. In a nutshell though, it sounds like Isabella spent this time in various different countries using a false identity, mostly isolating herself from anything more than surface-level human interaction and avoiding staying in one place for too long. Although she said she felt somewhat safe, she was constantly looking over her shoulder, worrying that she'd revealed too much to anyone she had so much as a brief encounter with. I don't know how much of Isabella's past was revealed in the original blog, but going off the posts that were re-uploaded on her new site, it's not entirely clear why she ran away in the first place. She mentioned that her family had arranged a marriage for her. Clearly it's a marriage that she didn't want, but why couldn't she just decline it? Although, as she says, her father is a very powerful, influential, and potentially dangerous person, what's the worst that could happen if she chose not to marry the man her father arranged for her? It doesn't sound quite like a life or death situation. I'm sure there would have been many consequences. Perhaps he'd disown her, refuse to continue funding her lavish lifestyle, and for someone in her position who had only ever relied on her family, that would be very difficult. But would it be more difficult than going on the run and living under a false identity for the rest of her life? Bear in mind that her father apparently had connections in various different countries. He had private investigators looking for her, and without specifying exactly what would happen, she implies that there would be grave consequences if her family caught her. So surely there had to be more to it than what she has revealed. There isn't really much more context on Isabella's current or past situation at all on the blog. I have a feeling that when she resurrected it, there were many more posts that have since been deleted. But like the original blog, this URL has been excluded on the Wayback Machine, and I couldn't find any more archives. I'm not sure exactly why or what happened, but it sounds like Isabella landed herself in some legal trouble resulting from the content of her original blog. She mentioned that 2 lawyers had quit over the issue, so I can only assume that further legal problems forced her to remove content on the second blog too. However, in 2018, Isabella wrote an entry on her current blog stating that she was working on 3 novels about her life, titled Letters from the Dead, The Prodigal Daughter, and From Among the Spires. In the same post, she said that there are a number of surprises in store in the months to come, but there doesn't seem to be much in the way of updates since then. As far as I'm aware, none of these novels have been published. I don't even know if she's still intending to release them. If so, I'm guessing we'd get answers to some of the questions that people have been dying to know for almost 21 years now. But by far the most important and baffling question we all have is any of this real, or is it all some elaborate hoax? Going off what we've covered in the video so far, you might think the answer is obvious. It's clearly a hoax. Surely the story is just far too sensational and at times unbelievable for it to possibly be real. What separates this from other stories told by anonymous internet users, though, is that there's actually some pretty compelling evidence to suggest that this is not just pure fiction. First, we'll take a look at why people were generally convinced it was a hoax in the first place, and then we'll move on to why it might not be. As I said a minute ago, with Isabella's story being so out there, and considering she wouldn't be the first or the last person to create a fictitious online persona, the default conclusion would of course be that the blog is just a creative writing piece. Her writing style mirrors that of a work of fiction, it has the hallmarks of a Hollywood movie, and her announcement that she planned to publish 3 novels on her experiences might on the surface make it seem that the blog was simply practice and preparation for her future career as an author. It's possible she was already an author, presumably using a different name to Isabella V, but of course no one knows, because no one even really knows any personal details about Isabella V, let alone the person behind her, if Isabella is simply a character. It's worth noting that she seems to vaguely imply in more recent updates on her blog that she's out of the woods now. I don't know if she ever returned to her family, or at least if she reconciled with them, but it sounds like she might no longer be on the run. She actually signed off the message where she announced the novels with, Isabella V, just starred. Of course this could be a red herring, but if her family had stopped trying to hunt her down, maybe that's why she's now planning to publish the novels, because she's no longer at risk. Either way, she has never publicly provided any solid evidence to verify any parts of her story, which is understandable, as there's always the chance it could lead to her being identified, or her location being revealed. But even before people started dismissing everything they read online with pics or it didn't happen, a story so outrageous surely needed something other than Isabella's word for anyone to actually believe her. Some readers of the original blog wondered if She's a Flight Risk was an alternate reality game, or ARG, and that's a theory that hasn't been definitively disproven to this day. One of her blog entries is simply a wall of code, which is very common in ARGs and usually reveal clues once deciphered. Her more recent annotation on this coded post suggested that it was not intended for the general public, but rather a message for specific people. She didn't state who or why. She has also linked her Twitter account since she resurrected the blog, which made some wonder if there were clues in her posts, because why would such a mysterious and guarded individual want to be followed on Twitter, even if she didn't post any identifying information? But she posts on Twitter like a regular person. As far as I can see, there's no mention of she's a flight risk, no cryptic clues, no indication that she is living anything other than a normal life, which in my opinion certainly isn't solid evidence either way, but you would think that if this was an ARG, the Twitter account would clearly be a part of it. Another website linked on the current blog leads to an image of a map of the world with certain areas circled and notes suggesting Isabella's travel plans. There are also photos that, when clicked, reveal more blog posts and presumably fake documents, such as a report related to tens of millions of dollars being stolen from a Swiss bank, and another detailing 2 failed captures of Isabella by unidentified individuals. Interestingly, both these reports end with a line stating that the full incident reports will be available to cleared personnel in 2024 and 2025 respectively, suggesting that despite her recent absence, there is more to come of She's a Flight Risk in the not-too-distant future. The site that features this information just screams ARG. It alone would be enough to convince me that it is an ARG if it weren't for some of the information we're about to cover that suggests that there may be some truth in this story. In May 2023, Leander Carney wrote an article for Wired that aimed to analyse the credibility of Isabella's story. After she had commented on someone else's blog, Wired managed to trace the IP address to the Bahamas, which was consistent with part of her story at the time. From what I gather, Isabella never revealed her exact location at any given time, but she may have hinted at it or stated the general part of the world she was currently visiting. At the time she left this comment, she was believed to have been somewhere in the Bahamas, and her IP address corroborated this. This doesn't prove her entire story, but if you believe this was all a hoax, it is surprising to see that at least her location was verified. It's worth noting that while VPNs did exist back in 2003, they were nowhere near as sophisticated as they are today, and they certainly weren't as widely used. As the Wired article acknowledges, Isabella knew how to maintain her online anonymity. She used various complicated techniques to ensure she couldn't be traced, which in itself could give credibility to her story. Why go to such great lengths to protect your identity just to keep a hoax going? Anyway, her being aware of such techniques means that it's not beyond the realm of possibility that she would have been aware of VPNs at the time, but the fact that her IP address was traced from one of her comments on someone else's blog really makes it seem like an oversight on her part, rather than an intentional red herring. Again, it's all a lot of effort to go to just to keep the hoax going, and bear in mind that even if her IP address wasn't consistent with her suspected location, that wouldn't really disprove anything, considering it would be expected that she'd perhaps mislead readers about her location to prevent her family finding her. So I doubt she'd even think to set up a VPN to make it look like she was somewhere else. Sean Paul Kelly wrote a number of articles about Isabella for The Agonist, including one that proposed a couple of known socialites that he theorised may actually be Isabella. So far, I've avoided theorising about Isabella's true identity. There is a good reason for this, as you'll soon see, but I will briefly summarise one of the most popular theories. It has been suggested that Isabella is Isabella von Fink, von Fink being a German former banking family worth billions. There are a number of similarities between the two Isabellas, the most obvious being the name, and that they are both European heiresses with influential families. However, Isabella von Fink doesn't appear to have ever been estranged from her family. She's a bit older than the author of the blog, and she's never really been out of the public eye. I'm not sure what we know about Isabella V's father really matches with Isabella von Fink's father either. Helmut von Fink is certainly a wealthy and somewhat influential individual, but he seems to be one of the lesser members of the family, so to speak. He had always gone his own way, both academically and professionally. He didn't do particularly well in school, he got into the wrong crowd and took drugs in his younger years, and even became what some might call a hippie, meditating with Bhagwan monks and participating in groups in an attempt to release energy. All this resulted in him being seen as somewhat of a disappointment to the family, and also led to him being cheated out of, as he put it, $1 billion inheritance after his father died in 1980. He may have eventually turned his life around, but considering he was never one to play by his family's rules, would he really have condemned his own daughter for simply not wanting to marry a man he picked out, to a point where she would have to go on the run and feared for her safety if he ever found her? Despite some similarities, I highly doubt that Isabella V is Isabella von Fink, hence I don't see a problem discussing that theory in this video, but I will avoid further speculation on her true identity. Anyway, back to Sean Paul Kelly. After he wrote a number of articles featuring details from what he stated were insider sources, he claimed to have received a threatening cease and desist letter from lawyers representing Isabella's family. The letter demanded that he reveal the identities of the insider sources he'd communicated with, and also that he take down all of his content related to the situation. Subsequently, all the articles were removed from the Agonist, and now, searching Isabella V on the site doesn't yield a single result. I've mentioned a couple of times that I've struggled to find any archives of any deleted information related to Isabella. Same goes for the Agonist articles. This is very unusual, and I think it's a fact that perhaps also adds some credibility to this story for a few different reasons, as well as the fact that Isabella herself has been known to ask other bloggers to take down posts about her. If She's a Flight Risk was all just an ARG, or a guerrilla marketing stunt for the novels that Isabella claims to be writing, wouldn't she want all the publicity she could get? You could argue that the cease and desist letter sent to Sean Paul Kelly was a stunt to make the story more believable, and overall, that might have been worth sacrificing some of the coverage. But despite getting caught up in a plagiarism scandal related to his coverage on the Iraq War around the time he became interested in Isabella's story, he is a legit writer and presumably not a naive idiot. I doubt he would have been easily fooled by a fake legal letter. Surely he would have verified its authenticity. So if he's telling the truth about receiving this letter in the first place, I have to assume it was legit. It's one thing to ask people to remove content about you from their blogs, but it's another to hire lawyers to send a cease and desist letter to get content removed from the internet. Not to mention, this letter was allegedly sent by legal representatives of Isabella's family, not Isabella herself, meaning that if all this is to be believed, there is evidence to support the existence of a family who do not want information about this story to be public knowledge, which again supports Isabella's story. It's worth noting that some have speculated that Sean Paul is actually the mastermind behind the whole Isabella V saga, that he created the blogs, fabricated the story, and faked the cease and desist letter to make it all seem more believable. He mentioned in one of his articles that a New York literary agent was interested in publishing Isabella's story, with hopes it was real, but even stating it wouldn't deter them if it wasn't. This led people to wonder if Sean Paul had created the Isabella V persona with hopes of landing himself a book deal. The problem with this theory, though, is that this book deal never happened, and Isabella has apparently rejected numerous offers from companies wanting to turn her story into a book, as well as various requests for interviews. As I said, you'd think Isabella would want all the publicity she could get if the blogs were to promote a future book, so why not accept interviews? With this in mind, and if Sean Paul is Isabella, why would he remove his content related to Isabella? He would have faked the cease and desist letter himself, so he'd know there was no chance of him facing any legal action as a result. He could have published the letter and still not removed the content, but instead he complied with the letter, and seemingly never even uttered Isabella's name ever again. For these reasons alone, it's unlikely that Sean Paul is Isabella. And additionally, perhaps a much weaker but still worth mentioning point is that Isabella's blog entries do not read like they were written by a man. As the writer of a post on ShylockHolmes.blogspot.com puts it, there's an odd tendency for hoaxes that involve a female protagonist to be written by a man. Being male fantasy, they tend to eventually end up focusing on male fantasies of female sexuality, with the characters being lesbian, bisexual, or that kind of thing. She's a Flight Risk had virtually none of that, other than one or two references that weren't particularly sexualized and instead focused on the charisma of the men in question. In that regard, at least, it suggests a female writer, or a male writer very committed to representing the protagonist as sounding more female. As a quick side note, the same post also references a line in one of Isabella's posts on the original blog, and explains why they think it might also add some credibility to the story. Quote, "There's one detail in particular that seems plausible in hindsight that would have been harder to come up with at the time. Here's a line from the April 2003 entry on some of the people that she encountered. Also among the exiles was a fairly famous software magnate who had elected to leave the United States, not so much for the tax issue, though that played a part, but more for the everyday nonsense of regulation. A software magnate living in a sunny tax haven type country back in 2003 who left due to the tax issue and the everyday nonsense of regulation. Tell me that doesn't sound an awful lot like John McAfee, who recently managed to get out of Guatemala and escaped back to the US to avoid questioning by the police over a murder. The point is that if I were to think of a name to add now about someone who might have been travelling in the Caribbean back in 2003, I'd pick a description of McAfee. But this one predated by many years the publicity that made him famous as a rich guy living in tax haven countries. While the vague description could potentially match John McAfee, it definitely could just be a coincidence. Still, if this writer is correct, the story would be even wilder if Isabella had somehow crossed paths with John McAfee, and for the plot, I'd like to think that actually happened. Anyway, the next piece of information that suggests against this blog being a hoax is the result of the research into Isabella's domain registration. The company that registered the domain was, at the time, located in Panama and has since moved to Liechtenstein. The name of the company is Aerobeta Sociedad Anónima. This name has been decoded as follows. Aero means flight, beta means the measure of financial risk, and Sociedad Anónima can be abbreviated to SA. Put that together and you get Flight Risk SA. Rearrange and assume the SA is an abbreviation and you get She's a Flight Risk, the name of Isabella's blogs. This is far too on the nose to be a coincidence, so means that if this is a hoax, whoever is behind the Isabella V persona went to a lot of effort. Not to mention spent an estimated several $1,000s to set up a shell company in Panama and later relocated that specially set up company to Liechtenstein with the sole purpose of creating a hoax that ultimately resulted in no financial gain, or any other kind of gain for that matter. At this point, I'd be intrigued to know which scenario seems more plausible to you. Isabella's story is true, or at least has a decent amount of truth in it, or it's all an elaborate hoax that's been kept up for 2 decades, with such attention to detail that ensured the writer's IP address matched the character's location at the time. A believable cease and desist letter was sent from a legit legal firm, in addition to the removal of all archives of the original blog and various other sites covering the story, plus the effort and expense of setting up a shell company with the sole purpose of hiding the domain registration. In my opinion, there's simply no logical motive for this. It's not for financial gain because whoever is behind it has spent a significant amount of money setting it up without making any money back, and has actively declined opportunities to profit from it. Considering the amount of time, money and effort that's gone into this, I find it hard to believe that it's just an ARG with no purpose whatsoever beyond stumping a bunch of internet sleuths. Fact or fiction, this seems to be more of a personal project, as in the story has been told for personal reasons, and whatever the specific motivations are, they're arguably more consistent with the story being true than with it being fabricated. And the case for it being true doesn't end there. By far the most compelling part of this story is that John H. Richardson, a reputable journalist, claims to have actually met Isabella. In January 2007, John wrote an article for Esquire titled "The Search for Isabella V." He begins his investigation, as many do and should, a skeptic. He summarises the story, implying throughout the first third of the article that this has to be a load of bullshit, before he slowly starts to wonder if there might be some truth in it. He manages to contact Isabella and asks her for an interview, presumably knowing his chances are slim to none, but surprisingly she accepts, under very strict conditions. First, he would have to contact her attorney, Mr. Caesar, in Panama. He was intentionally hard to reach, and she didn't make this any easier for him. Second, she demanded editorial control on the final article. John was determined to track down her attorney, but explained to her that there was no way he could meet her second request. She ended up compromising on this, forfeiting her desire for editorial control, providing she could review the transcript of the interview. To cut a very long story slightly shorter, after being forced to jump through various hoops, John was eventually instructed to book flights to Las Vegas, El Paso, Seattle, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. His highly anticipated meeting with Isabella could occur at any one of these locations, and of course she wasn't about to reveal exactly which one until the very last moment. A couple of weeks later, he received a call from a man named David who claimed to be on Isabella's security team, telling him the meeting would be in either Las Vegas or San Juan. He'd be given the exact location 24 hours before. The next time David called, he told John to book the flight to Las Vegas and to email a description of the car he'd be renting and the hotel he'd be staying in, then wait for further instructions. Later that day, John received another call informing him the meeting would be pushed forward a day or cancelled. Then, in a bizarre turn of events, he was informed that Isabella and her security team had been separated and they believed she had been snatched. After a brief period of John's walls coming down slightly and him starting to wonder if maybe there was some truth in Isabella's story, the latest development just sounded ridiculous and left him once again convinced that this was all a facade. Then a few days later, there was another call from David. The meeting was on. After a few more vague instructions and a little more waiting, John was told to go to the Ritz-Carlton and tell reception he had a meeting with Mr. Smith, and so he did. He described what happened after the receptionist directed him to the meeting room. Here are a few excerpts. I have plenty of time to take in my surroundings, to note the single white orchid on the coffee table and the Dell laptop open on the desk. The bed in the other room is rumpled, and there's a man with a very big gun, a black assault rifle that looks very modern and high-tech. He's pointing it at the floor at a curious angle, and my mind goes into one of those dreamlike blurs that take over when you get into an accident or a fight. The man throws something metal at my feet. In a soothing and courteous voice, he says they're handcuffs, and he's very sorry but he's going to have to ask me to put them on. It's procedure. I look down and it's like a shot in a movie. Close up on police cuffs. They shine like mercury. They look heavy. That's not going to happen, I say. Then you'll have to sit down and let me search you. Fine, no problem. Search away. He's strikingly handsome and very well dressed. Dark suit, fancy loafers, French cuffs. Some kind of ethnic blood gave him brown skin and Elvis black hair. Filipino, maybe. You're David. He nods. Obviously that's not my real name. Then he tells me to empty my backpack of old tape recorders, cameras, pens, and other metal objects. I can only use one pen to write, but best not to make any sudden movements. Then he mutters into his earpiece microphone and takes a stance in the doorway to the bedroom with his weapon pointing diagonally at the floor. A minute or two passes and then the door opens behind me. David holds his stance. I twist in my chair to see. Close to the root of faith, there is a longing for the blissful mindless days before we ate of the fruit of knowledge and saw that we were naked and were ashamed. On the other side are the modernists and perverts who say we should take ambiguity as a challenge and invent the future as we go along. But both sides agree with this. The minute we put names to things, we stepped into a symbolic world where nothing would ever be fixed and solid, where we are haunted by words, the ghosts of real things. Reading this story, you're still in that symbolic world, but I'm not. I've stepped through the looking glass. This is real. She's thin and pale, with significant hollows scalloped under her eyes, and fine hair that orangey colour you get when you try to go blonde but don't quite make it. About 5'7", slender, and elegant in black heels and black pants and a white top. Isabella sits in the armchair at the other end of the coffee table. John and Isabella spoke for a total of around 2 hours, during which time she described what it's like to be on the run, always having to have security around her, planning each move, feeling like she's traded one prison for the next. She acknowledged it was all insane, but stated that she wouldn't put anything past her father. She spoke about her reasons for starting the blog, and even admitted she was starting to think it had been a mistake, but she'd become attached to it. Then the topic of conversation turned to Eve, the man her father had arranged for her to marry. Quote, "They grew up together," she says. She even had a crush on him. And then one night, out of the blue, her family and his family went to dinner, and the two fathers started talking about a trust fund and a dowry, and at first she thought they were talking about some other couple, and then it hit her, and then it hit Eve. He got up and walked away, and I started crying. There I was, rejected already, even before I was a bride. He did not want it at all, and it was very clear that I would only be the wife, never the lover, never the desired, and I will only marry for love. She'll never understand why her father was not amenable to argument. It wasn't the families were a particularly good business match or anything. She couldn't figure it out. She almost felt something was being kept from her. And even now, she sometimes thinks she's just acting like a spoiled rich girl, and if Eve hadn't bolted from the table, maybe she would have tried to make it work. But why would her father want to marry her to a guy who was going to treat her like shit for 50 years? The interview ended shortly after she opened up about Eve, and after this, John had a short conversation with David. Quote, "He tells me he got his start some years ago in counter-narcotics work somewhere in Latin America, and researched this carefully before getting involved. What tipped it was her family, how ruthless they were. That's not how families are supposed to behave. In the first few months on the run, they found a bug at least once and had to blow town a couple of times when the searchers got too close. They chronically underestimated the search effort. Fortunately, Isabella had resources of her own, tens of millions, which was good because the team was expensive and they couldn't fly commercial anymore. This trip alone cost $75,000. Eventually, they would have to find a way to stabilize the situation. He wants me to know that Isabella is fragile. She has nightmares, lots of stuff about being chased and not being able to run fast enough. She probably couldn't survive without money. She doesn't know how to have relationships, to flirt and be normal, but she is not a bird you can keep in a cage. Even after her blog cost her 2 lawyers, she still kept publishing the damn thing. And being her security man was no picnic either. She's this post-adolescent redhead," he says with a meaningful shrug. "It gets tough." As I walked out through the hushed lobby a moment later, the friendly clerk says, "Goodbye, Mr. Richardson." It's dark out now and chilled by a fog so thick it makes my face wet. Later, the doubts will come back. An assault rifle at the Ritz-Carlton. Who really wrote that threatening letter to agonist.org? Couldn't a big-time lawyer solve all this with one phone call? In a week, I'll ask her to let me call her parents for comment, setting off an ugly episode of suspicion and hostility. But that all comes when I step back out of my body and get back to the world of symbols, safe at my computer, and it will never feel as true and alive as this moment right now, walking through the misty, chilled streets with the city lights turning the fog gold. I was wrong to be so cynical. Sometimes you really do make a connection and rise to the level of your dreams. Isabella is real, I think. She still writes to me, telling me about the landing strips in the middle of nowhere and sitting in a charming open-air room on an island known for its beaches. She talks about melting into the world and the wonderful moment where the rain breaks. I check my Hushmail account every day. There's my plane, she says today. Gotta go. If there was any way of knowing for sure that this really happened, then of course we'd have to say, case closed. Isabella definitely exists, and her story is 100% true. While I do find this article to be the most compelling piece of evidence to support the authenticity of Isabella's story, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little skeptical. Most of this comes from the thought that I just have to keep revisiting. This entire tale is absolutely bizarre. How could it possibly be true? But then I remind myself that sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and even if there are thousands of stories as dramatic as this one that are all fabricated, once in a while there's gonna be one that isn't, and who's to say that one isn't Isabella's? I have no way of knowing if the encounter John described even happened. The only proof we have is his word, and considering after this article was published, he's the only person thought to have actually met Isabella and personally verified her story, there was certainly motivation for him to lie. One might even wonder if John himself is Isabella. If this was all one big hoax in an attempt to propel his career. But for similar reasons I don't believe John Paul Kelly is Isabella, I also don't personally believe John is either. John appears to be a relatively credible journalist. A quick Google search reveals nothing to suggest he's been caught out in any lies or scandals that might affect his reliability. If he was found to be lying about this, his reputation would likely be ruined and his career potentially over. Moreover, John didn't post this article on his own personal blog. It was published through Esquire, a well-known magazine, which of course doesn't mean there's no way it'd share false information, but it's not like John could have just made up any random story and publish it. There'd have to be a lot more people involved. There is a possibility that this interaction did happen, but John unknowingly met with someone else who isn't Isabella. Maybe she set up this meeting to prove her fabricated story and make the hoax seem more real. But again, what would be the motivation behind this? They met at the Ritz-Carlton, a 5-star hotel that would have cost an arm and a leg just to hire a room out for a couple of hours. It's all more effort, more expense, and for what? By the time John met her, it had already fizzled out. The original blog had been deleted, and people had likely moved on to the next current internet mystery. It would be 6 years before the blog was resurrected, and at this point, Isabella's story had mostly faded into obscurity, and she had aided in this by doing everything in her power to erase her name from the internet. I went into this rabbit hole thinking that the simplest explanation is that all of this is a hoax, but at this point, Occam's razor would suggest the opposite. It's interesting that there is no actual evidence to prove this is a hoax, it's all just assumptions and opinions, whereas there is a decent amount of evidence to verify it. Many would question why Isabella, being on the run and her life seemingly in danger, would risk writing a blog to tell her story. She answered this herself in the blog, claiming that it was like an insurance policy. If her story was public, she hoped it would be harder for her family to make her disappear because people would notice. But if you're wondering why she wasn't too scared for her safety to write this blog, I think you've failed to analyse and understand her character fully. I haven't read anything to suggest that Isabella's life was in serious danger before she ran away. She didn't leave because she feared for her life or even her well-being. She left because she wanted an adventure. In many ways, she had a life that many people dream of. She had everything she wanted. She had no idea what it felt like to struggle. She would never have to worry about where her next meal would come from or whether she would be able to pay her bills next month. Her family was so rich that she didn't even have to worry about how she would pass her time on a slow, rainy Sunday afternoon. She could wake up and make a plan to travel anywhere in the world to do anything she wanted on any given morning and be there doing it that very afternoon. She lived a life so luxurious that most people can't even comprehend it, and yet she was bored. It wouldn't even be accurate to say that the novelty of these luxuries had worn off, because she had never known anything else. That was and always had been her life. and as bizarre as it seems to someone like me and maybe you, it sounds like she wanted a challenge. She wanted to know what it felt like to struggle. She had grown tired of the excitement of everything good you can have in life, and so all that was left was the bad, the dangerous, the unfamiliar adventure that came not only without the support of her family, but with the active condemnation. That, in my opinion, is why she ran away, and as for the blog, it was part of the danger, and therefore the excitement. This was all one big game to Isabella, and she seemed to get a kick out of flaunting the fact that she had escaped and hadn't been caught yet. Furthermore, humans in general possess an often irrational compulsion to confess their secrets. Perhaps we all seek the thrill of danger in that way, albeit to a lesser extent than Isabella. How many serial killers have anonymously confessed to their crimes? Even on a more relatable level, thousands of people create a throwaway Reddit account to confess their sins every day. I'm sure you can remember a time you confessed a secret that objectively did you no favours and may have even risked a relationship or your reputation, and yet you just couldn't help yourself. I don't think it really helps at all to evaluate the veracity of such a story in terms of your own subjective frame of reference, especially if it's a situation you've never been in and never will be in. And yet these types of analyses are all we have when it comes to trying to disprove this. I wouldn't have done that. It sounds unbelievable. It looks like an ARG. None of these arguments really prove anything though, and who's to say this situation is black or white? Perhaps there's a good amount of truth in Isabella's story, but with some embellishment. Maybe she is a rich heiress, but with a much less interesting life. You could spend days analysing everything Isabella has ever said and making your own mind up on whether or not you believe her, and you'd still never know for sure. And that's what I find absolutely enthralling about this tale. As much as I'd love to know the truth, part of me would like it to remain a mystery. And I wonder how much it really matters. Without getting too philosophical, life in many ways is an illusion. If we lived our whole lives believing something that really doesn't affect us, does it actually matter if it was true or false? Of course, the chance that a story is true always makes it more interesting, but She's a Flight Risk was such a gripping and thrilling tale that people would get lost in it. You could start reading the entries with the intention of analysing its authenticity, and 5 posts later realise you've done zero analysing and instead just become immersed in the adventure. So I guess it's up to you to decide whether you believe Isabella or not, or if the truth even matters in this case. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments, plus any suggestions you might have for a future video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Remember to click the link in the description to download Huge Casino for free and get 5 million chips. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week in a new video.